First of all, thank you for the very kind introduction, and thanks everyone for coming on this rainy day, especially on a Friday. So I'll set this up a little bit. My colleague Mark Frenette and we've been working on occupational skills research for a little bit. We've released a couple of papers in the last 2 years or so, and we've received a fair bit of feedback from people about this. So we've kind of extended that research in what I'm going to present today to look at how different, what we call vulnerable groups in Canadian society, how they might be affected differently in terms of skill gaps. So, next. So background, why study skills? We probably don't have to talk too much to this crowd about why it's important to study skills. We've heard a lot about it over the past couple of days. It's really dominated the discussion of the future of work in Canada. A lot of current debates talk about different types of skills. We need diverse skills for future jobs, and it helps to have a range of skills for adaptability, and we've heard that quite a bit coming from different speakers at this conference already. Within the Canadian context, we don't have a lot of skills data available. We do have some that looks at measures of individuals' literacy or numeracy skills, but individual skills aren't always reflected in the kinds of work that people do. So we wanted to look at more detailed information on occupational skill requirements in order to get insight into the skill levels that individuals use in their current jobs. So just a bit of background when we're talking about vulnerable groups in Canada. I've selected 4 groups in particular to look at. A lot of the studies that exist for these groups really focus on earnings disparities as well as differences in employment status. So there's a lot of talk about the gender wage gap. There's some work done on individuals with disabilities. Immigrants are another real focus of research in this vein in Canada. And more recently, people have started to look at older workers and their labor behavior, basically, and the outcomes from that. So we wanted to look at how skilled are the jobs that these individuals land in the Canadian context. So our main research questions are the occupational skill gaps between are there occupational skill gaps between vulnerable groups and their counterparts? Do occupational skill gaps exist across all skills, or do vulnerable groups experience a disadvantage just in particular skills? And do occupational skill gaps change when socio-demographic, educational, and regional factors are accounted for? So I know people's eyes often glaze over when the data slide comes up, so I won't spend too much time on it. But I wanted to include it here because one of the studies that my colleague Mark and I released, we got a lot of feedback from people in the policy community in Canada contacting us and asking us about the data and our methods and how we went about looking at these issues related to skills. So what we did, we used the National Household Survey, and we linked it with Occupational Information Network skills data. So for anyone who's not familiar with ONET, which is the short form, it's data on skill level requirements of occupations, and we looked at 35 skills that they provide. It's US data, but it has been used in a few other Canadian studies, as well as OECD has used it for cross-national comparisons. The issue with why it's not used very much in Canadian research is because of the occupation level. It's occupation level data, and we have a different occupational classification than what's used for the ONET. So some colleagues of mine actually developed a concordance that allowed us to translate the ONET scores over to Canadian data. So it's important to know that it's occupation level data, and so we've linked it with occupation codes from Canadians in the National Household Survey. So just briefly about the analysis, I'm going to provide you with some information about differences between groups, and also some results based on multivariate regression. So again, the dependent variable we're looking at is occupational skill level requirement scores. It's a 0 to 7 scale, where 0 represents no skill level required. And the skill score, again, is an occupation level, not a measure of individual skills. So it's based on what's required of individuals' jobs. So we've included a number of independent variables, so sociodemographics, education, highest level of education and field of study, as well as a geographic variable controlling for economic region. So this table basically came about from our previous work. We did a factor analysis of all of these 35 skills because we'll be here all day if I talk about every single one of these 35 skills. I'm just going to look at specifically the ones that are highlighted in that yellow gold color. So reading comprehension, writing, mathematics, science, complex problem solving, instructing, installation, programming, and management of financial resources. So the selection of these skills was partly because we thought that they might be of policy interest, but also some of them had some interesting results that might be useful for policymakers. The one thing I wanted to point out is one of the things that came out of this research, the earlier research we did, was the technical skills. So really, they kind of divided across two lines. So technical operation and maintenance skills are more of the repairing, troubleshooting, equipment maintenance. And they were quite high for people who had trade or apprenticeship certificates, but low for higher levels of education. But otherwise, the remaining skills pretty much rose as education levels rose. So looking at women first, so just in terms of their basic differences, really the main difference between men and women in Canada on average is that women have higher levels of education than men. So we can see that in terms of highest level of education, men are more likely to have less than high school. Women are more likely to have a bachelor's degree. And again, we see a difference in trade apprenticeship, where men are more likely to have this kind of education level. Looking at field of study, probably not a surprise to most of you, where we have women are a bit more represented in terms of social behavioral sciences and law, and men are more represented in architecture and engineering. Women are also more likely to have studied health fields and health-related fields. So these are just some of the basic differences that we see between men and women. Now this is the results from the regressions. So basically the way this is presented, it's an occupational skill gap as a percent of the average skill level of men. So that's the comparison group. The top bar, the black bars, that's the unadjusted score. So that's just the raw average difference that we're looking at. And then the blue bar beneath that is the adjusted. So that's when we control for sociodemographic, educational, and regional differences. So what we see with women is we actually see a slight skill advantage in reading comprehension and writing skills, and that is reduced a bit when we control for education and other factors, but we still see a slight advantage. And this is in other analysis that we did, it's largely attributable to their higher levels of education. But we do see disadvantages, even when we account for their education. So mathematics, science, programming, and management of financial resources. Installation is another one that it's on the other side of technical skills. So it's more related to individuals in the trades and apprenticeships. So the differences we see there is that there are some advantages across some skills for women, but they also have skill disadvantages compared to men across many skills as well, even when they have similar levels of education. So for immigrants, again, we see a difference in education levels. So in Canada, we have very highly educated immigrants overall because of our selection system. It's largely attributable to how immigrants are selected to enter Canada. So we see that Canadian-born individuals, non-immigrants, are more likely to have a high school diploma as their highest level of education, whereas immigrants are more likely to have a bachelor's degree or a higher level degree than Canadian-born. So in terms of fields of study, there are some differences as well. So we see that immigrants are a bit more likely to take business management fields, as well as math, computer, and information sciences, and architecture and engineering fields. They're more likely to have studied than non-immigrants. So how does this play out in terms of skill levels, skill gaps? It's kind of an interesting story here. The black lines, the unadjusted lines that we see, they're largely positive in favor of immigrants. This is largely due to their educational advantage. So overall, on average, the jobs that they hold are better or higher skill levels than Canadian-born on average. However, when we account for educational differences, regional differences, we actually see a disadvantage. So it moves in the other direction. So basically what we're seeing is that immigrants who have similar characteristics as Canadian-born individuals, so if they have the same education level, they are actually at a disadvantage in reading comprehension, writing, mathematics, science, a lot of these skills in programming and management, financial resources. So we do see quite a difference there when we account for these different factors. So looking at individuals with disabilities, generally we see that disabled workers have, they're more likely to be older workers, and they're also slightly more likely to have less than a high school education compared to individuals without disabilities. And they're also a bit less likely to have a bachelor's degree. So there are some educational differences there. When we look at field, there's actually no real difference that we could find between individuals with disabilities and individuals without disabilities across fields. So that was an interesting thing, although I don't know if it tells us much, but it's interesting to know. So in terms of the skill gaps of disabled workers compared to non-disabled workers, we see that they have a disadvantage across the board. Everything from reading, writing, math, and science, complex problem solving, instructing, programming, and this even after we adjust for differences in other characteristics, it doesn't really reduce the disadvantages too much across most of the skills that we looked at. And in fact, we actually see a bit of a greater disadvantage for management of financial resources. Yeah? Okay. So this is based on the regression results. So we have a gap that the regression results indicate for disabled workers, for example. So when I create a percent of the average skill level of non-disabled workers. So our comparison group is non-disabled workers. The assumption is that they have a higher skill level generally than their counterparts. So we actually convert the regression coefficient, which is the gap, into a percent of their counterparts' average skill level. It's their occupational skill level for the occupation in which they're working. Does that make sense? Yeah. It's kind of hard. We often struggle to explain this to people because people often go to the individual skill proficiency and that sort of thing, and this is on the occupational level. So. Yes. Yes, exactly. Of the average score of the counterpart. Yeah. Great, thank you. I'm sure probably other people were wondering. Okay, so older workers, what we see, first of all, we define it as 50 plus. I hope that doesn't offend too many people. But we were basing this on a couple of previous research studies that were out, so we thought 50 plus, that's what we'll choose. But I have a comment about that after. Maybe I'll say it in the conclusions. But I'll just say here that there are a few differences we can see. So older workers are more likely to have a disability. And there's a little bit of difference in terms of their education level. So older workers are a bit more likely to have less than high school as their highest level of education. Younger workers are a bit more likely to have a bachelor's degree than older workers. There are some field of study differences, not very large though. We see that younger workers were a bit more likely to have studied social, behavioral, or law, and older workers are a bit more likely to have studied architecture and engineering. So when we look at the skill gaps, the occupational skill gaps, we see that the older workers are actually advantaged across several skills, so reading, writing, math, science, as well as management of financial resources. This is probably related to their experience. Unfortunately, we don't have that data available to us to really investigate that more in depth. What we see when we control for education and other factors, a lot of the skill advantages grow a little bit, and the only real disadvantage is in the installation skill. And again, as I mentioned earlier, that's a very different set of skills, the technical operation and maintenance skills. So that's what we see for the older workers. So just general conclusions, disabled workers and immigrant workers, when we controlled for socio-demographic, educational, and regional factors, they actually experienced occupational skill disadvantages across all skill areas that we looked at. Some groups experienced advantages in certain occupational skill areas. So women had advantages in reading comprehension, writing, and instructing, whereas older workers had advantages in numerous skills, reading, writing, math, science, for example. And I was going to say, I was going to comment on the age definition. I actually read an article recently that was saying it might be 55, at age 55 when people's labor market behavior starts to change and orients towards retirement behavior, or realizes that retirement might not be an option, and so that might be something to consider for future research, that age cutoff is a bit of a question, and maybe it's more of a generational issue to look at. And women, immigrants, and disabled workers were experienced skills disadvantages in technical skills. So the two technical skills we looked at were installation and programming. And just to kind of conclude, so while the socio-demographic, educational, and regional factors reduced some of the skill gaps or skill disadvantages, the differences remained in most cases. Notably, we saw that immigrants' initial advantage turned into a disadvantage when we accounted for these factors. We did some additional kind of behind-the-scenes work, and this is really, really driven by the education factor. Older workers' advantage increased. Their advantages increased, and initial disadvantages in instructing, programming, and they changed to a slight advantage for this group. So what can we make of all of this? Well, the results do indicate that some vulnerable groups are experiencing difficulty in accessing higher skilled occupations than their counterparts with similar socio-demographic, educational, and regional characteristics. This was particularly evident for immigrants and disabled workers. So the question there is, if they are having more difficulty in accessing these higher skilled occupations, what are the barriers and what can be done to kind of overcome this and make things more equitable? And that's it for me, and there's my email if you wish to contact me. So, thank you.